Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun, written by Jessica Russell. Today is Wednesday, May 12th. Julian rode slowly over the meadows, trying again to understand how he could have lost his brother and father within a month of each other, and now Catherine also. The house already seemed like a mortuary, and he found it difficult to imagine how dark it would become once Catherine's serene presence was gone as well. And who would kill his brother? He thought of everyone in the area, from lords and barons to merchants and servants, and there was no reason he could think of for anyone to want to hurt his kind, good-natured brother. He knew very well Catherine had nothing to do with it and was simply at a loss. Robert never offended a soul. He was an extraordinary man, and Julian's greatest fear was that the crime would never be solved. No matter how much he threatened those working on the case, if there were no leads and no trail to follow, how could he demand a resolution? His father was another matter. It had hurt much to lose him, yet he was ill, and his eventual death was expected. But above all that, they knew the reason for his death. It was not shrouded in a bizarre and troubling mystery as Robert's. Those were his thoughts as he rode away from the field, and on impulse he turned Rudy to stop at Robert's grave. Then perhaps he'd go and try to speak with Catherine, to make amends if that were even possible. He knew in his heart that his treatment of her was not justified. True, some of it did stem from distrust. However, a large part of his animosity was nothing more than jealousy. He knew it was time to admit that, if only to himself. Julian loved his brother dearly, but he wanted Catherine to choose him. She's an intelligent woman, for I would never have offered her marriage. And he knew in his heart that did not show goodness in him. As far as the man she had met in the woods, it didn't matter anymore. She loved his brother and had not played him false, that much he knew. "Well, Rudy," he said aloud, as if the horse could hear and answer, "maybe I can somehow redeem myself in the second half of my life." When he arrived at the grave, he was not surprised to see Catherine. She was sobbing hysterically, absolutely overcome with grief. This composed, resourceful woman, now so lost and helpless, and he had not able to comfort her because of the wedge he'd driven between them. He knew he was intruding, yet he did not possess the strength to walk away. He thought about the episode of that kiss in the hall, which had suddenly become a horror to him. He wanted to speak but had no tongue, feeling as if blinders had slowly come off his eyes over the past several weeks. Suddenly she heard him and leapt to her feet. He opened his arms as a fiercely intense urge to comfort her swept over him. With the sun and her tears blinding her eyes, she thought it could only be Christopher, as it was always the first thing he did when he returned from a trip. He would open his arms to her, and she would run to him and hug him tightly and thank God for another safe return. Suddenly she stopped, and a look of utter hardness came over her face, and Julian instantly knew she was enraged at his gesture. He also couldn't help but note that, even exhausted and angry, she was still of the beauty that takes one's breath away. "What do you want?" she spat. "Leave me be." "Catherine, I'm so sorry. I should not have come up on you so quietly. I didn't think." "You never think," she cried angrily. "Not unless it's of yourself. Why did you open your arms that way? The notion would not have come to me that you would do that. You would have to be human for that to happen. Was it because you knew you couldn't fool me on the second time wearing Robert's clothes and had to come up with something new? Trick upon trick with you, isn't it? It's no more than I deserve. Did I not once assign false motives to her and make my own unreasonable assumptions? Catherine, please, you know Get away from me. Do you really think I believe you're sorry for anything? You've never been sorry for anything in your life. How Robert's blood even exists in your body is something known only to our Creator. If not for the fact that you were twins, I would think you were a changeling. Leave me alone with God and my grief. I'm begging you." Inwardly, she apologized to the twins' father for breaking her promise, but unforgiveness had again tightened in bands around her heart. She covered her face with her hands, defenseless against her own violent sobs. She wanted to fall on the grave and bury all her pain, heartbreak, and wretchedness with Robert. "Catherine, please, I will do anything I can to comfort you." He stood there looking at her helplessly. "Comfort me? Can you bring Robert back from the dead?" she hissed. "There is no comfort for me. My life is over too. I was buried as well. Only I must go on living, but wishing I were dead. You? Help me? You are cruel and shallow and understand nothing. Nothing. Fearing she was truly becoming hysterical, he stepped toward her and tried to take her shoulders, but it only made her more furious. Do you think you are God? She shouted, shoving him away violently. People are here for whatever suits your intentions at the moment and then discarded after their purpose is served. Don't you dare speak to me of comfort. You have done your best to make my life miserable since I came here. All the time of my marriage, when I would have given anything for a bit of respect from you. You think you can make amends now? It would have been better if the Almighty had made only one of you. Oh, Catherine, have you no mercy for me at all, then? Of course you don't, and why should you? He was amazed at the physical strength she displayed as she pushed him away. Don't ever come near me again with your phony sympathy. Catherine, so help me God, I cannot get away from here fast enough. Stay away from me until then. I could not live here in peace. Can I grieve in peace, Lord Julian? Her sarcastic words stung even more fiercely because he knew he deserved them. I believe you're about to spit on me as you did your father, he said at last. Don't give me new notions. You might spit on your brother's grave for all the respect you gave his wife. He opened his mouth as she mounted her horse and departed, but no words formed. He stood there until she was out of sight, and then, beginning to feel like an unwelcome guest at his own brother's grave, he mounted his horse and rode back to the manor under many oppressive thoughts. He felt in his soul a new grief, which was not for Robert himself, but for Catherine. The next morning, which was unusually cold, Jennifer found Julian sitting alone in the garden, and there was a helplessness about him she'd never seen before. In a very short amount of time, he bared his soul to her about his feelings of guilt concerning Catherine and Robert. Jennifer understood, as she always understood everything, but for once could offer no practical advice, as she could not predict if the rift would ever heal. It feels better to talk to you about it, but I have no idea how to go on from here. She truly loved him, Jennifer. It wouldn't have mattered if he were a peasant, and all I did was accuse her of having false motives. Then it all became so clear, and in such a short amount of time, the way she was after his death. It was not the kind of grief anyone could fake. Think of her defense of Robert, who was certainly in no need of it, such as when she spoke of his clothes, pointing out that he did not make the foolish mistakes I do. Jennifer looked at him thoughtfully. Yes, she replied, it is how you speak when you are in love. You defend unnecessarily. You point out virtues you believe others failed to notice. She constantly did that with Robert. How wrong I've been. It's so obvious now, but how she hates me. She will never accept a simple apology. It's gone way beyond that now. Grief needs someone to blame, and you two have been doing just that. But is there no chance of ever making amends? Of course, there is always a possibility of anything. However, it will not be within the time frame you desire, and therein lies the problem. You are never able to wait for anything. How long do you think it will take? You must ask someone wiser than me for the answer to that question, brother, she replied sadly. Coming to find them in the garden, Richard said, I hate to be the bearer of sad tales, but I passed Catherine's room, and it indeed looks as if she's planning to depart. I suppose I must contact Rosen, Steed and Rosen, Julian said dourly, since she is absolutely determined to do this. She cannot go without money. Naturally, Robert left her well provided for. She refuses the money, Jennifer said. Well, she certainly can't leave here in penury. I never heard such nonsense. Surely she knows she cannot do that. Julian, rather than have a pointless conversation with her, you must listen to me that she emphatically refuses to take even more £1 of the money Robert left her. Apparently she has enough to get away to France. But trust me when I tell you, Richard, and I have been trying to talk her out of this for days. She won't change her mind. Well, I must try again, Julian said. You are tilting at windmills, and no good will come of it. You must realize once and for all that the situation is out of your control and allow destiny, fate, whatever it is called, to chart the course. This war between you two has taken on a life of its own, and only time will tell if we'll ever see her again, or if there will ever be peace between her and yourself. Face that it is out of your hands now. You must stop obsessing and draw on your calmer, more pragmatic side at this time. My calmer, more pragmatic side is in the family graveyard, Jennifer. He shot back, and an eerie silence enveloped the three. Finally, he said, Robert will come back and do me a mischief. if I allow his wife to go off to France alone in poverty due to my unconscionable behavior. Unfortunately, that is something you need to think of before now. Her words pierced his heart, and in his current state of mind, all he felt was Catherine's pain and the damage he had done. What was their redemption? Was there a way to undo some of the turmoil and hurt, or was it truly hopeless then? Could he never make peace with this woman he now realized was a great treasure? It can't end like this, Jennifer. There must be a way to begin again from here. Everyone would like the chance to begin again when things have gone wrong, but life does not always give us that, and we must accept whichever way it turns. Well, I won't accept it, he said vehemently. I can't, and I won't. Jennifer watched him as he strode off, knowing his determination, but also filled with the knowledge that, as unlikely as it was, his will was no match for Catherine's. Later, after coming back from a depressing ride in miserable weather, he was enraged to see the Ashington's carriage at Briarwood. Why is Lizette Ashington here? He stormed as he came into the hall. Julian shall hear you, Carissa said. Much I care about that, Julian shot back and attempted to calm himself before entering the drawing room. Paul was probably with her, and he did not want to be rude to his friend, even though he inwardly seethed at Lizette, whom he knew was only making the most of the situation to bring herself into his company. He greeted Paul, who was indeed there, and virtually ignored Lizette, who was incensed at his indifference, but did not let it show. I wish there was something I could say, Paul said at last. The person I want to hear from is Linton. I don't understand why they cannot come up with anything at all. Somebody, somewhere, had seen something. How could it have happened, Paul? It is as if God has taken some of the light from the world. God didn't take him. A madman did, Richard said. Well, who was he? Julian raged, bringing his hands down on the table, rattling the glasses and sloshing brandy from the decanter, which Sarah swiftly and silently cleaned away. Richard put his hand on Julian's shoulder, and Paul began to say something, but immediately stopped when Catherine entered the room. She glanced at everyone as if they were pieces of furniture, poured a brandy, and proceeded to turn and leave without a word, no longer caring about what anyone thought of her, least of all Julian. What a malicious gleam in her eye, Lizette told Catherine as she had heard she might be going back to live with her father, at which point Julian's expression looked positively murderous. Paul quickly began to speak, but Catherine interrupted him without looking at Lizette or slowing her steps toward the door. The only father I ever had is dead, she answered stoically, disappearing from the room without a backward glance. Julian felt as if the air was knocked out of him, and he looked at Jennifer, who appeared to be on the verge of tears. That was utterly uncalled for, Lizette, Paul said, and turned to apologize to Julian, but he had already left. As angry as he was at Paul's sister, he wanted to catch up to Catherine rather than do battle with Lizette. He followed her without being too obvious and came upon her in the room where they had once discussed the sun on the windows. Catherine, I want to see if perhaps I can persuade you to stay, he said at once without ceremony, thinking that if he asked her to listen, she would likely get up and walk out before he had a chance to speak to her. At least stay for a while. You're hardly over your grief, nor any of us. According to you, I felt no grief. So what do I have to be over? She said monotonously. Catherine, I misjudged you. I am not too proud to admit it. It's caused pain and misery for us all, and I most humbly beg your pardon, but I cannot change the past. I'm not too proud to beg you for forgiveness. You should not be too proud to forgive me. She didn't respond, but stared out towards the meadows, her thoughts far away, and he realized she really hadn't been listening. There was something burning in her mind, something in her eyes he could not read, a hardness he'd never seen before. It gave him a wild twinge of alarm. Catherine, speak to me. What do you see as you stare off that way? You seem so far from me right now. Won't you say anything? What matters? In 2 days I'll be gone. Catherine, please stay. I am not a cruel man. At this she finally met his gaze, her expression of one of bland cynicism. Turning back to the window, she said, I don't believe anything you say, and I never want to see this place again. Her words had a finality that chilled him, and realizing it was a finished thing, he was seized by a great depression. He did not stop to examine his feelings, for he knew all too well what they meant. Finally, he turned and left the room. for he knew there was nothing he could say that would make any difference at all. She was going to leave, and that was the end of the matter. He could not hold her against her will. He had lost his chance. It was over.